Good evening, everyone, and welcome to Boston SpedPac's April General Meeting on Transition Services via Zoom conferencing. My name is Lisa Connor, and I'm the Parent Support Coordinator for BPS's Office of Special Education. Okay, great. So we have 5 individuals serving as co-hosts and/or presenters this evening, along with staff from the Office of Special Education in attendance. A couple of things to note before we begin. Tonight's meeting is being recorded and will be available after the meeting, not right after the meeting, but by tomorrow, probably. Spanish interpretation is also available. Interpreters and attendees are able to click interpretation in the meeting options and select the language channel. Participants in the channel will hear the translated audio and also the original audio at a lower volume. We are muted. I was going to ask that we mute your microphones during the presentation, and we mute it because we want to reduce the noise background and to allow for as clear a sound as possible during the presentations. Questions and feedback can be entered into the chat for the Q&A session from 8 o'clock till 8:30 p.m. Thank you.
So our first presenters are going to be Melanie and Alicia, who are going to be talking about transitions and just with special education law. So if you'd like to start sharing your screen, Melanie and Alicia, for your slides, that'd be great.
Excellent. Thank you, everyone, for allowing us to join you tonight. I am going to attempt to share our presentation with you. So, all right. Does this look right?
Looking perfect. Go ahead.
Okay, thank you. Alrighty, so I am from the law firm of Kotin, Crabtree and Strong. I am here with my colleague tonight, Melanie Jarboe, who will also be doing part of the presentation. As Roxy had mentioned, we are going to be talking about transition planning. And we're also going to do an overview of the impact of COVID-19 and how that plays out in the special education field right now. It is developing, and we will try and touch on the key developments and flag some things to consider. And then we will also be taking questions at the end. So kicking off the transition planning basics. We are certainly going to be talking about the details of what transition planning entails. But first, let's talk about when transition planning begins. I don't know how many of you here have transition-aged children, but it's never too early to begin thinking about transition. Officially, transition planning begins during the IEP period in effect when the student turns 14. But there's nothing that prevents transition planning to happen before then. 14 under state law is the key age. Under the federal law, it's 16, but Massachusetts starts it earlier at 14. So if you have a kiddo who is approaching that age, you want to start thinking about transition planning. So start early and revisit yearly. The revisitation piece is similar to the way that IEPs are revisited yearly. Transition planning is a similar process, and I believe Melanie will get into the nuts and bolts of the team process in just a little bit. So the IDEA, it's the federal law, it's the cornerstone of special education law. Many of you might be familiar with it. if we look at the purpose of the IDEA, it is to ensure that all children with disabilities have available to them a free, appropriate public education that emphasizes special education and related services designed to meet their unique needs and prepare them for further education, employment, and independent living. So transition planning is part of, and it's not separate and distinct from FAPE. It's written right into the IDEA's reg. That part of FAPE is to prepare students for further ed, employment, and independent living. So that is the key language here that guides transition planning. Transition planning is a formal process, and so let's take a look at kind of what transition services mean, and what that looks like in practice. So transition services means a coordinated set of activities for a child with a disability that is designed to be within a results-oriented process that is focused on improving the academic and functional achievement of the child with the disability to facilitate the children, to facilitate the child's movement from school to post-school activities, including post-secondary ed, vocational ed, integrated employment, including supported employment, continuing adult ed, adult services, independent living, or community participation. So to kind of boil that down, the services and goals target essentially training, education, employment, and where appropriate, independent living skills. So services cover a full range of areas. They can touch on one or more of those areas depending on the student's needs. Goals must be written with a result in mind. So that's what it means by a result-oriented process. And the goals, like all IEP goals, must be measurable. The second part of transition services is it's very individualized. So it's based on the individual child's needs, taking into account the child's strengths, preferences, and interests. And it can include a whole host of things. So we look at instruction, related services, community experiences, the development of employment and other post-school adult living objectives, and if appropriate, the acquisition of daily living skills and the provision of a functional vocational evaluation. So again, one of the key parts here is that this is a very individualized process, and it's a very student-centered process. And I think Melanie will touch on this in a little bit, but the transition planning process, it's very important that, if possible, that the student participate in this process, which might be a little bit different than typical IEP team meetings. And so it really does, it does consider the student's strengths, preferences, and interests. And on to graduation. So it's kind of one of the key things to know when we're thinking about transition, when we're thinking about graduation, at graduation with a regular high school diploma and special education eligibility. So a student with special needs who is on an IEP is eligible to receive special ed services until graduation or the age of 22. And so if a student has met local and state graduation requirements and has passed the MCAS exam, they are eligible to graduate in theory. Now, when we're thinking about transition-related planning, if a student with disabilities has met everything that they need to meet in order to qualify for that diploma, a district may not properly graduate the student if the district did not provide a FAPE to that student. So you look at whether that student has made progress in those transition-related areas, and there's a whole host of those, the ones that we just discussed a little bit earlier in terms of employment, independent living skills, vocation, post-secondary ed. I mean, they are quite expansive, and so you know, we want to consider when a student is eligible for graduation, you know, whether he or she is ready to graduate based on the progress that they have made in those transition-related areas. And so if they are ready to graduate, by all means, but if not, there are processes by which, you know, parents are able to, or the student, depending on the student's age, is able to effectively kind of reject that diploma if transition related goals have not been met, if there hasn't been measurable progress toward those goals. Graduation is a change in placement, so you need prior written notice for that. Again, that is the opportunity to be able to, you know, a parent and a student can assess whether that FAPE has been given, and whether that student is ready, in fact, to move on. So, you know, that needs to be consented to. And then, you know, I mentioned this a little bit earlier, but to earn a regular high school diploma, we have that, you know, in quotes, all student must pass MCAS and meet local graduation requirements. There is, you might have heard about a certificate of completion. Sometimes it's called a certificate of attainment. That is issued when a student has met the local requirements for graduation, and has not passed MCAS. And that is separate and distinct from a diploma in that it does not end special education eligibility. And so kind of the determining factors there really come down to whether the student has met what we call competency requirements. Those are your MCAS, standardized test requirements. And if not, a certificate of completion can still be issued, but the school district will still be obligated to provide that student with a special education. And so eligibility is not cut off by the issuance of completion, but it is cut off by graduation with a high school diploma. And I'm going to pass this off to Melanie.
Thanks, Alicia. If you could toggle through the slides, I can't ask to control your screen. So if you could go to the next slide.
I will do that. I figured out a lot of things flashing on my screen, and that wasn't one of them. So I'm prepared to toggle.
We tested this out earlier today, but please bear with us. So the next part of transition planning is obviously to talk through the team process. It's a process that happens in the normal IEP team, but obviously just for those students who are 14 and up. So as Alicia mentioned earlier, the student is really a central part of transition planning, not just the student's needs, but also the student's perspective. It's called person-centered planning, and it's really a best practice for a team who is discussing transition planning. Obviously, good planning of any kind starts with an evaluation in the special education world, but in the transition world, it's particularly important that we do an evaluation before we start talking through the plan. And a good transition evaluation should include a number of different parts, using multiple evaluations like any good special ed evaluation, multiple perspectives, teachers, transition staff, the student him or herself, and the family, plus any outside providers that may be involved in the student's life. We also like to see an observation as a part of a good transition evaluation. Sometimes that's a community-based observation. Sometimes that is a school-based observation or a home observation, depending on the student's needs. But the idea is that we really want to get a robust view of the student's strengths, weaknesses, transition-related needs, and that student's own vision as well. There's always the opportunity if a district evaluation is inadequate for some reason, you can always proceed through the independent evaluation request process. You can also find an independent evaluator and get some transition planning on your own. Many district evaluators do a marvelous job. I just want to flag that in case there were any questions. That transition evaluation is subject to that IEE process, just like any other evaluations are. I noticed that Kelly Challen herself is on the call with us today, but this blog post of hers from a couple of years ago, possibly, it's on the next slide, the proper citation, but in any event, Kelly talks through, oh, it's very recent, great, thanks Alicia. Kelly talks through the attributes of a successful transition meeting and gives a sort of a personal experience of a successful transition meeting. And I think it's really useful for team members and parents alike to take a look at some of these attributes of a successful meeting. Because transition planning is often a bit of an afterthought, particularly at the beginning of that transition period, starting at age 14. Every now and then we talk through the IEP. We have a robust discussion of a student's strengths and weaknesses during the school day. We talk through what they may need in terms of services and accommodations and goals. And then many times parents have never seen the transition planning form when it arrives with the IEP 10 or 12 days later. And so it's important that we're all sort of going into these meetings thinking about transition sort of at the beginning, that we allow transition to kind of drive the IEP process as opposed to being an afterthought, particularly as a student gets further toward that senior year, that end of eligibility, turning 22, whatever it means for that particular student. So really, it's a really collaborative process, making sure that each stakeholder brings their own perspective and their own thoughts about the student's transition needs to the table. And obviously that student, him or herself, is really sort of sharing that discussion and being as central a part of the discussion as possible. Next slide, please. Thanks. And obviously the assessment data really underlies the discussion, the student's vision, and also this knowledge of resources that exist. And that can often be a tricky thing. It's not immediately apparent what transition resources exist in any particular district, in any particular city. It can be sometimes a bit of a scavenger hunt to try and find these things, but coming to the meeting prepared to talk about potential resources and having talked with other parents, having talked through some things with different members of the school team can really be a helpful way to ensure that that meeting goes well. And we've got some transition resources a little bit later in the presentation. And obviously this whole presentation will also be available to you, the slides, so don't worry too much about taking too many notes during this. Okay. So this is the transition planning form. I just wanted to flag a couple of parts of this transition planning form, since it is sort of appended onto the back of the IEP and is not always sort of given the attention that it may need. So one thing to draw your attention to right up front is this anticipated date of graduation in that first box. That should be talked about by the team and agreed to. If for some reason your transition planning form comes and you've either not talked about the graduation date or you disagree with it, go ahead and flag that in your IEP response, just so that it's clear to everybody that this wasn't something that that everybody talked about or agreed to. So we want to make sure that we keep an eye on that so it doesn't sneak up on you. For example, if a team has your child slated to graduate at the end of what would be their senior year and you feel strongly that they need continued services, that's a conversation that should be had early and often. And then in terms of the post-secondary vision, as well as the disability-related needs on the following page, these boxes should correspond to what's in the IEP, but shouldn't necessarily just be copied and pasted from the IEP, unless, of course, the IEP itself is the result of really robust transition-related discussion, right? Often we see, goal areas copied and pasted into transition that really have nothing to do with the transition-related discussion. So we really just want to make sure that this transition planning form is used to inform and reflect a robust team discussion about the students' transition needs. You also want to make really sure that the services talked about in the action plan here go onto the grid, and that the action plan, instruction or employment or what have you, gets into the goal areas as well. Again, the transition planning form should not be an afterthought. It should not be just sort of appended to the back of the IEP. It really should be reflective of the team discussion, and also, the services, if they're indicated on the transition form, those should also be in the grid. And now I'll hand it back to Alicia to talk a little bit about different transition options.
So the big question you might be asking is what's next? And we're going to flag some resources for you. Some of them you might have heard of already. Some of them you might not have. So in terms of what's next, there are a variety of programs. I mean, there's a lot of in-district programs, and these obviously vary district to district. And I believe that that somebody will be speaking or touching on that tonight. But in terms of kind of what's available statewide, what's available through private and public programs, there are many options. One of them is the Massachusetts Inclusive Concurrent Enrollment Initiative. I believe it's referred to as MACE. This is for students who have not received a regular high school diploma. And so if the students are between the ages of 18 and 22 and have not passed MCAS, they are eligible for participation in this program. And what this program is, it's a state-funded partnership between certain school districts and public institutions of higher learning. And so there are, various colleges and universities in the area. This is something that on its website, if you just Google this, you can get a whole listing, and there's a map, and you can do it based on geography as to kind of what schools participate. But I just flagged a few here: Bunker Hill Community College, the Mass College of Art and Design, and UMass Boston as being pretty local options. So that's something to think about. There are also specifically designed college programs. And so the Threshold program at Lesley University is one, and the transition program at Middlesex Community College is another. But a lot of, and I think more and more these days, colleges and universities have programs kind of within themselves. And so that is something that certainly, if it's appropriate for the student and the team agrees, is something that the student may be able to participate in, in order to meet those transition goals. And there's also state agencies, and there's a variety of them that kind of kick in at various points, kind of when a student is transitioning to adulthood. I think that we have a slide later on about that. We do. So just kind of skipping ahead here. School districts must provide transition planning and services. So that is an obligation that rests with the school district and the school district alone. However, there are many situations in which other entities, so these state agencies, might be involved in providing programming and services. And I highlighted a few here. DDS is one of the main ones here. DDS works with adults with intellectual disabilities and developmental disabilities, including an autism spectrum disorder, to connect them with an array of employment and day program supports. There's community living supports, there's other types of residential aid and family supports. DDS also works with children, but we're just going to focus right now on kind of the work they do with adults. A lot of times this is referred to as the Turning 22 services, where students, hopefully transition seamlessly. If they need special ed up until they're 22, they transition seamlessly to DDS services if eligible, if they fall within kind of the eligibility standards that DDS has. You might have heard of a Chapter 688 referral. This is something that's completed by the school district. I believe that there's a little place for this right in the transition planning form that Melanie had highlighted before, whether a Chapter 688 referral has been made if appropriate in the case. And so that referral is completed by the school with the collaboration of the family to identify the need for supports for adults with severe disabilities. And again, the goal there is to really provide this link between the school services and the adult agencies to hopefully provide for a seamless transition. Other agencies that are certainly involved and at the table and are part of many productive team meetings are DMH for mental health staff, the Massachusetts Rehabilitation Commission, which covers a whole host of services and helps people with disabilities to live and work independently. And the kind of one caveat there is kind of except for adults who are blind, and then there's the Mass Commission for the Blind that is set up and of great use to that disability. And so if a student is transitioning to a post-secondary education, so kind of a college or university, the landscape looks a little different when you've been on an IEP or a 504 plan. Certainly, it becomes there's a real balance, I think, between students once they get to college, advocating for themselves. There's certain kind of privacy considerations that they might consider, and then again, kind of the need for accommodations. And so this becomes something where the student needs to, has to actively apply, kind of all along the way, from the time a student is on an IEP. I mean, there's obligations that are on the school district in terms of child find, in terms of identifying students, in terms of these yearly meetings. There's a lot of rights that are built in to protect students with disabilities at up till age 22. At kind of the post-secondary level, the onus really is on the student. And the student needs to apply for accommodations. And it's important there to have, to kind of go in hand with the documentation, the evaluations that you have that support, that identify what the disability is, what the accommodations are that you are seeking. It's good if you have a really robust accommodations plan, either as part of your IEP or as part of a 504 plan. It's not transferable in the same way an IEP might be, kind of from district to district or school to school. But it's something that's important to have with you. I think a lot of schools do a good job of helping students kind of, while they're still within kind of the high school setting, kind of working through with them as part of the transition plan as to how you handle accommodations requests, how you identify kind of the office that you need to go to, how you identify the key players. The key players there, they might be called a Section 504 coordinator, an ADA coordinator, a disability services coordinator. They go by various different titles depending on the school, depending on the office. So that's something that it's important to kind of map out beforehand. And again, I mean, the key here is really to be proactive. If a student is struggling and hasn't kind of brought, the disability or the request for accommodation to the school's attention, the school is not going to be essentially on the hook for knowing that. So it is important to make sure that, requests are documented, and that you're identifying and talking to the right people. And here are, as Melanie said, you are going to have access to the slides. So these are two good resources, one right from the State Department of Ed, and another from the Federation, which is one organization. So those you can access as well. And I'm going to switch this back to Melanie, who is going to take us through COVID-19. We hope you all are managing okay and are healthy and safe. And we'll talk about the implications of COVID-19 on special ed.
Thanks. Yes, this discussion obviously presupposes that everybody is doing okay, and our hearts go out to those of you who are struggling with illness, with essential work, with difficulties accessing online instruction for your kids, and wanting to talk a little bit about the special education elements of this, and also give you some resources to take a look at for yourselves to inform your discussions with your own school personnel. So as we all know by now, schools have been closed throughout the Commonwealth until at least June 29th. So that obviously loops in the end of the 2019-2020 school year. We're all hoping that things will be back up and running for summer services for those of our kids who get extended school year summer services. But it's obviously not a foregone conclusion that opening will be able to happen. The spring MCAS has also been canceled for grades 3 through 10. And we want to make sure that folks know that, and particularly the kids who get anxious around MCAS time this year, they get the year off. And this school closure does not apply to residential schools. Residential schools are up and running, most of them. Some had asked parents to take their students home. Others have had COVID-19 outbreaks in-house. But most are functioning in a safe and as normal as possible an environment for the students who live there, and are abiding by the nursing home visitation policies. So many students have been isolated from their families, which is very, very difficult, but sort of in the name of safety at this point. So very, very important to understand. There have been a lot of different iterations of this plan, starting from that initial school closure mid-March through the present. Starting in late March, I think March 26th, DESE, Department of Elementary and Secondary Ed, put out a frequently asked question sort of guide that I've linked to at the end of the presentation for your reference. But that makes clear that the right to FAPE, so free appropriate public education, the right to adequate services, meaningful progress, continues, for students on IEPs throughout the period of school closures, consistent with the need, obviously, to protect everybody's health and safety, both of students and of service providers. Next slide, please. In addition to the right to FAPE, there's also a right to placement. So for those students who are at an out-of-district special education school, whether that's a day school that is currently closed pursuant to the governor's order, or a residential school, if for some reason that residential school had asked the parents to take the student home, or the parents had made the decision to take the student home, that student does have a continued right to placements, and districts should be continuing to fund those placements so that the student can return when it is safe to do so. However, DESE and the federal government have cautioned us all that the provision of FAPE is obviously going to look a lot different during this shutdown than it ever did when we were in school. You know, this slide is all quoted from DESE's guidance. Again, linked at the end of the post and available to you later on. But you know, essentially the message is that parents and school personnel need to work together to figure out what FAPE looks like for each individual student during this period of closure. It's, you know, asking a lot of both teachers and parents to try and figure out remote learning and teaching and everything all at the same time. But you know, it is the goal of DESE and the fervent hope of all of us in the disability advocacy community that parents and teachers will be able to really connect and make a good plan for their kiddos during the period of the shutdown. So that includes specialized instructional opportunities, that includes accommodations, and that certainly includes the underlying principle that students with disabilities have the right to FAPE during this shutdown, that they've got the right to services and supports that enable them to keep on moving forward as learners. One thing that the governor's, DESE's guidance really calls out is the fact that timelines are going to just have to shift. That means, you know, evaluations are not happening right now, team meetings are happening, but on a kind of a case-by-case basis, remote team meetings where possible. Districts across the state are just kind of gearing up for remote meetings in many cases, and trying to limit the number of remote meetings even, because it's a lot to get all of these people together on Zoom, and the meetings are obviously quite different on Zoom as opposed to live in the room. One piece of the timeline issue that is actually good news in the last few days. There was some really significant concern that Betsy DeVos, the United States Secretary of Education, was going to recommend a waiver of IDEA rights for the period of shutdown, which would mean that students with disabilities on IEPs would not have the right to a FAPE, would not have the right to meetings, any services or supports during this shutdown. And Betsy DeVos would have had to ask Congress to grant the waiver. She submitted her document requesting waivers to various education-related laws to Congress the other day. She did not ask for a waiver of the core provisions of IDEA, which is really great news. What she did focus on in terms of the IDEA relevant to this discussion and to one question that we had submitted in advance of this presentation is about the turning 3 period of time, so the transition from early intervention or Part C of the IDEA services to Part B, so the school age, age 3 and up. And basically what she's requested a waiver on is the ability for early intervention to continue providing services to toddlers past the age of 3. So preventing that total shutdown of services that otherwise would happen when a toddler turns 3, given that school districts across the nation are having a difficult time sort of processing incoming preschoolers. Now, this is not totally finalized. This all went to Congress, I think, earlier this week or late last week. So as with so many other things about this coronavirus situation, communication with your team is really key. And that's especially the case for those those two-year-olds turning 3 who do not have early intervention services. For those of you who are really waiting for those services to start through BPS, you want to make sure that you're communicating with your team and that you get a virtual team meeting on the books if at all possible. Okay. So IEP meetings, this is lifted directly from DESE's determination or DESE's recommendations, but obviously these IEP meetings are, occurring via Zoom or telephonically, if at all. Some districts are asking parents sign waivers to allow for the virtual format. If you do receive a waiver to sign, I would just be sure that that's all you're waiving, just that virtual format and the absence of certain key personnel who may not be able to make that particular time. We want to make sure that waiving large-scale waivers of rights are not happening in concert with these remote meetings. And there is a note there about translation being necessary during these remote meetings, just as during other meetings. So the question of compensatory services really sort of underpins many of the questions that we're getting from parents, the concerns that we all have about our kids during this period of time. Services are not looking the same as they looked in the classroom, and sometimes services are completely absent. And recognizing that, compensatory services would be ordinarily the remedy for that. Compensatory services, very simply put, are, if you have a student whose IEP says, I need 1 × 30 per week of speech language services, you got a letter on the first day of school saying, we don't have a speech language pathologist, we're working on hiring one. 3 months into the school year, you get another letter saying, we've hired Mr. So-and-so as our speech language pathologist, who will now be delivering your child's services. Your child is owed 30 minutes per week of speech language services for the duration that there was no staff member providing those services, right? Now, compensatory services during the coronavirus shutdown is a little bit more of a complicated question. It's been made clear by both the federal government and the Department of Elementary and Secondary Ed here in Mass that whether or not compensatory services are going to be appropriate is a discussion to be had by the team later on. It's an individualized discussion. People are not automatically entitled to compensatory services. I think that that's sort of unfortunate. It means that there's going to be a lot of person power devoted to discussions about compensatory services once we get back into school. I think there maybe were some easier ways for DESE to outline this, but it's also understandable. Many kids will have very significant effects from the shutdown, and many other kids may have minor effects. Maybe increased one-to-one attention will do them good. For other kids, they don't have the ability to have one-to-one attention if parents are working and so forth. So an individualized determination is not necessarily a terrible thing. But DESE has also made very clear that school districts are to do everything possible now to provide the required services to sort of mitigate the need to deliver compensatory services after we all get back to school. So that's a really important piece of this, to make sure that team members understand that that we're doing the best we can for kids and the best we can for teachers later on if we all work together to deliver needed services now. There's also a recommendation to grade academic content as credit or no credit, so that kids are not really being penalized grade-wise if they're not able to access the instruction or perform as well as they may be able to in the classroom. DESE is also encouraging districts and schools to promote students to the next grade level, as opposed to holding back an entire country, world worth of children, given this shutdown. My hope would be that instead, when everybody gets back into school, that the efforts are redoubled to provide students with services and supports that they need to make up the ground that they've lost and also to make progress going forward. And communication, communication from the schools to the parents. is obviously key and is a central part of DESE's recommendation. They're saying that an IEP team member should communicate regularly with parents and guardians, and that the frequency and the type of that communication will vary depending on the child's individual needs. And the goal is to keep kids and teachers connected during this time, to keep families connected. But from the parents' perspective, it's also really critical to communicate with your team what is and is not working for your student. This is an unprecedented situation. Normally, teachers and staff that have their eyes on your child day in and day out simply have no idea what's going well and what's not going well unless you tell them. And so communicating this clearly and effectively to team members can help you get improved supports during the shutdown, or if those improved supports either do not materialize or don't end up sort of enabling your child to kind of do better, it sets up a claim for compensatory services going on, and it can provide some really important data for a team when they're discussing whether or not a child should receive compensatory education. And in terms of remote learning, just got some updated guidance on April 24th, focusing on phase 3, beginning May 4th. So right after that period of time that this phase of the closures would end. The guidance focuses, this is multi-page guidance, again, linked at the end of this presentation, focuses on 2 things. Really defining recommended elements of a quality remote learning program, including focus on teaching the content standards most critical for student success in the next grade level. Again, reiterating that expectation, teachers are not expected to cover every single grade level standard, but instead, but neither are they expected to provide sort of the enrichment only that was the hallmark of the first sort of period of time when we were all out of school. So really focusing on those standards that are going to set kids up for success in the next grade, hopefully in the fall. And the other key part of that guidance, sorry, Alicia, can you go back one more time? Okay, is to encourage districts to move all of the students towards successful engagement in remote learning, given that there have been a lot of kids for whom the remote learning has been slow to start, either due to technology needs, support needs, disability-related needs, various reasons. The remote learning has been a really big shift for a lot of students and families and teachers. And so DESE has instructed everybody to really redouble their efforts to engage all students in remote learning. Also really important, the legislator enacted and the governor signed a moratorium on evictions and foreclosures during this emergency declaration. Has nothing to do with special education, but it does have to do with families, so I wanted to call it out here as well. And so here are these COVID-19 resources. That new guidance on remote learning that I mentioned is linked first. Frequently asked questions on special ed that involve the right to FAPE during the shutdown, linked second. BPS has a page that is full of coronavirus resources, including sort of district policies, as well as some resources for sort of activities for kids. And then the Federation for Children with Special Needs also has a lot of really good resources. I know they do Facebook Live chats as well, for those of you looking to connect with other parents. And so I'll look back to you, Lisa and Zachary, to let us know if you want us to answer questions now, or if we want to go to the Boston presenter.
Thank you very much, Alicia. Melanie, that was great. So the next step, we'd actually like to go to Marcia to talk about BPS transition services that are available. And while she's speaking, it'd be great if you guys could kind of also peruse some of the questions in the chat to see some of the ones that weren't touched upon while you were speaking, because people have been entering things. That way, after Marcia's done, we'll be able to answer some of those questions that we haven't touched upon yet also. Thank you.
Okay. So Lisa, are you gonna load my presentation? Are we muted?
You're not muted. I think Lisa's
Okay.
trying to pull it up right now.
Great, thank you, Zach. So I'd like to introduce myself. My name is Marcia Fitzpatrick. I'm the Assistant Director of Transition for the Boston Public Schools. It's my pleasure to be here this evening. I have been a career educator in the Boston Public Schools. I was a coordinator of special education, and I assumed this role in November of 2019. So I look forward to supporting you and supporting your students as they move through transition in the Boston Public Schools.
Lisa, you're muted if you're talking to us.
Do you have your presentation?
I don't see it.
Put it up, Lisa.
Okay, hang on. Oh, okay, hang on 1 second. You got it?
Perfect. It's up there. Just go back to the first slide.
Hang on 1 second.
Just use the back arrow on your keyboard.
Oh, here we go. Whoops.
Yep, that's right, Lise.
I'm
Yep.
going.
Hit that button. You're doing the right thing. Keep going.
Okay, all right. Sorry, guys. Here we go.
Okay.
Okay, Marcia.
So Lisa, are you going to have to?
I will be Vanna White for this.
Thank you, Lisa. I appreciate you.
Very welcome.
Okay, so welcome to a presentation for transition services in the Boston Public Schools.
Hang on. Okay.
Okay. Transition planning supports the development of a post-secondary vision for students, is a collaborative effort that involves students, families, school staff, and other important community members, and the process revolves around the student's vision for the future and identifies his or her preferences, interests, and strengths to develop a transition out of high school, a plan to transition out of high school. So in this presentation, I will give a brief overview of transition services in the Boston Public School. I will review the school's role, our STRIVE program's role, our community partners' role, and I will briefly introduce adult services. The school's role in transition the responsibilities are to conduct all transition assessments, whether informal or formal, throughout the child's transition years. The school also develops and implements transition goals and services. Transition planning occurs at the IEP meeting, and in the state of Massachusetts, the process for special education students begins no later than age 14. By age 14, students must be invited to the annual IEP meeting and where a TPF will be developed. This includes post-secondary vision statements, and it must be based on the student's preferences and interests. The student must be able to express their desired outcomes regarding adult living, post-secondary work environments, post-secondary living and work environments. The TPS drives the IEP, and the goals developed at the meeting should align with the student's vision. Lisa, I need you to go back to slide 3, 4, 5. Okay, now. Okay.
Which one?
So 5 and then 6. So now we're on 6. 6. Thank you. Okay. So the TPF, which was shown in the last presentation, should be thought of as a conversation starter for the IEP. It's important to note that it's a part of the IEP process, but it is not a part of the IEP. So different times that TPFs can be developed depends upon the situation with the direction that the student is taking. So a TPF can be completed prior to an IEP meeting or at the IEP meeting. For some college-bound students in the Boston Public Schools, guidance counselors will sit with them and go through the TPF, and that helps them to guide those students in formulating a direction for the type of school they would like to go to, size of the school, what they'd like to major in. For students who are non-diploma bound, TPFs can be developed in life skills classes or with their teacher so that they can have conversations about what their interests are, what they want to do when they finish high school, and, you know, post-secondary living situations. The TPF should also include all areas of transition, such as the activities of daily living, recreation, living experiences, lifelong learning goals, work skills, and travel. Next, please. IEP goals should align with the vision. So I have an example on the screen, which is the student's vision is to live on their own and travel independently to work in a retail environment. So IEP objectives for this student could include time management, which would be about reading train schedules so they're not late for work, setting your alarm clock, making sure you're getting 8 hours of sleep, laundry, which if you want to live independently, you need to know how to fold, hang, sort your laundry, money skills, which include budgeting and making change. We want students to be aware of the fact that they need to have enough money to not only pay some bills, but also to have enough money to travel independently, whether it's by the MBTA or if they choose an Uber. They should also think about building on social skills that are appropriate for work environments, and the potential to think about vocabulary that's associated to the field that the child wants to enter. So for this example, retail vocabulary would be apparel, electronics, housewares, etc. Some in-school job opportunities might be to work in the school store or into the work in the main office so that they can build their social skills and their customer service communication skills. So now we have developed the IEP, and we want to talk about what's going to happen next. So at this time, we're going to start focusing on that part of the TPF that talks about disability-related needs and the skills that the student wants to focus on to reach their vision. When we begin to talk about skills, we want to talk about pre-vocational skills and vocational skills, which are going to support the student in seeking employment or post-secondary education. And we reference these usually as soft skills and hard skills. So if you look at the middle of this Venn diagram, some of the soft skills we talk about, which are the skills that make you a good employee, are time management, communication, travel training, personal hygiene, your character, and your appropriate workplace behavior. Pre-vocational skills go across the continuum when we're working on vocational skills, and they're kind of like the entry to work skills. That's how we refer to them. These skills can be addressed in the academic setting as early as elementary school. They include sorting, matching, alphabetizing, categorizing, folding, collating, following directions, and completing time tasks. Then we move into vocational skills, which could also be considered hard skills. And those are the skills that a student needs to possess in order to enter into a specific college major or field of work. So office work, culinary skills, you need a certain set of skills to become a lawyer. Custodial work has a set of skills. Public safety officers, cosmetologists, computer programmers, writers and artists, and people that work in the construction trades. They all build upon those pre-vocational skills into more highly specific skills for the area that they work in. When we begin to apply these skills, we want to talk about the importance of in-school pre-vocational opportunities. Pre-vocational skills, again, are transferable as you move across the vocational continuum. They provide the introduction to the world of work. They develop prerequisite skills to work in community-based employment. They allow students to develop independence in a safe environment. They give students the opportunity to learn how to independently initiate and complete tasks, as well as increase pace and stamina for work tasks. So when a student is working in an in-school copy center, they learn to make copies or maybe collate. And in the beginning, that might be modeled by the teacher and then taught explicitly, step by step, where the teacher guides them through the steps until they're able to have enough practice and repetition to be able to work independently. And once they're able to complete those tasks independently, you can increase the amount of the task that you need them to do, or they can work for longer. So when we talk about vocational opportunities, we want to talk about the ability of students to develop more independence in, again, a safe environment. They can have opportunities to earn paychecks. Students are able to learn the dynamics of the supervisor-employee relationship, develop appropriate workplace vocabulary and communication skills. They can generalize what they have learned in the classroom to real jobs within the school and eventually to the community. And it also allows them less adult supervision and more opportunity for independent work. So those are skills that we're going to work on in the school-based setting. In the Boston Public Schools, we are very fortunate to have the STRIVE program. The STRIVE program consists of special education teachers on assignment, and their title is Community Connection Facilitators, and they are all assigned to schools that have students with disabilities from age 14 to 22. I'm often asked what STRIVE stands for, which is why I put the slide on. And their goal is to support transition to reach independence through vocational experiences. STRIVE's role within the Boston Public Schools is to be available to provide consultation to all schools. They facilitate between the BPS and vendor services and the adult service agencies. They facilitate Boston Public school year employment sites. They facilitate the Boston Public Schools summer employment sites, and they support families with the 688 process. Our pre-vocational and vocational sites that we manage during the school year are at the Wentworth Training Program, the Bowling Building, and we have a DISC program. And DISC is digital imaging, and that is conducted at English High School. During the summer, we run a vocational exploration and vocational program, and that runs concurrent with the ESY. In order to participate in the pre-vocational and vocational programs, students must possess prerequisite skills to participate. And this program garners a lot of interest, but I think it needs to be noted that it's important when teams are making decisions about summer programming that ESY, Extended School Year Services, should be implemented until the child meets their MCAS requirement. Once they finish their MCAS requirement, we can begin to do vocational X and BCYF programming. This summer, we were hoping to, we don't know what's going to happen with summer, but we were hoping to add a third part to this program for students who had not yet learned the prerequisite skills that they need to become part of the vocational exploration program. And so we were going to focus on building those skills, but also offer travel training and recreational opportunities to those students that had already met their MCAS requirement. The last group I want to talk about tonight is our community partners. we have a nice group of community partners, and they help to support us on the last step of the employment continuum. They provide training and evaluation for individual student participants. They work with students on securing jobs. So they will often work with students to physically go to a place where a student wants to work and help them fill out a job application. They'll do mock interviews. They'll talk about proper dress for an interview, and they will provide job coaching so that the student can securely begin to work in that position. The last slide I just wanted to introduce were the adult agencies. So when a student completes their high school requirements prior to the age of 22, or when they age out at 22, they go into an adult agency, and that's when their special education services with Boston Public Schools ends. And as it was stated before, that's Department of Developmental Services, Massachusetts Rehab Commission, Department of Mental Health, Mass Commission for Blind, Mass Commission for the Deaf and Hard of Hearing, and Department of Children and Families. And we work very closely with these adult agencies to ensure that students are through intake and eligibility. We support families in making sure that students are through intake and eligibility so that when they do reach the end of their high school career, that they can successfully transition into their adult agency. So, questions?
Thank you, Marcia. That's great. Appreciate it. So I know Melanie and Alicia have also been looking at the questions related to transition in the chat because we've seen a few pop up. So we can also start with just addressing some of those questions in chat. If there are any that you think could be grouped together to Melanie and Alicia that you see that are related to transition specifically, we'll start with, I do see some about special education and the current remote learning, but if we can start with those transitions, one of those would be great.
Sure. So one of the questions that came up about transition was specifically about that evaluation, whether or not a student who was perhaps due for a 3-year reevaluation at a different time other than during that turning 14 year should have a full evaluation that year that they turn 14. And the answer is probably not, right? Teams have the ability to move evaluation schedules up by a year or so, a year or two, if they feel the need. But during that period of time when your student is turning 14, if they're not scheduled for a complete 3-year reeval, you certainly have the ability to ask the district to perform a transition evaluation off schedule, and the discussion would then go from there. Another question was about activities of daily living in transition. If you have a student for whom activities of daily living is a topic that they're going to need help with, that should certainly be part of the conversation, part of the supports and services and the goal areas provided pursuant to both the TPF and the IEP itself. And I think that those were the only specifically transition related questions we got. There were a lot more about the remote learning.
Okay. So before we go on to remote learning, are there any other transition questions, whether from based on Marcia's presentation or Alicia and Melanie's presentation, or anything about transition at all that anyone wants to ask? Please feel free, or if we missed it from earlier, please feel free to throw it back in the chat so that we can address it. Just want to give you a minute to see if there are any. So you guys were so great at presenting about transition that those were it for the questions, okay. So now let's move on to some of those questions that are related to the remote learning of COVID-19, because I've seen several of those popping up.
Sure. So we've tried to group some of these COVID-19 related questions together. There was a number of questions about extended school year services, ESY services. Right now, the order has been that school is closed at least through the end of June. So extended school year services right now, it's to be determined as to how those are, going to be implemented and delivered. I think that they're, if the orders are extended, likely to be kind of following a similar remote learning model. But right now we just don't know. And so we await guidance as well from our state officials as to what that's going to look like. And unfortunately, this is a situation that is going on it's just a wait and see type of basis.
And then in terms of the question about the children of essential workers during the summer, there's been some talk, rumors, I would say, no more than rumors about summer instruction being offered as remote learning only. My assumption, again, we don't have any better information than you do about this, would be that the childcare facilities for essential workers would continue on through the summer if the only way that summer programming was offered was virtual. But again, there's no way to know at this point. And then another question just about essential workers. There was a good question about what's the expectation for essential workers, parents to be helping their students with remote learning. I think that it's a really important thing that you notify your IEP team of and your school personnel that you are not in a position to be able to help your student log into a million Zoom meetings or do a bunch of worksheets or navigate online resources. Again, the recommendation from the state is that kids are graded pass-fail. My hope is that teachers are working with you to provide you and your children with ways to meet whatever expectations they have, given the important work that many parents are doing right now. Go ahead, Alicia.
There's a question about out-of-district schools and technology. I can't locate it, but I believe what the question was kind of, is it the school district or is it the kind of the private out-of-district school or public out-of-district school that is responsible for providing that technology? And Melanie, correct me if I'm wrong. My understanding right now is that so I think right now the kind of the relationship between the public school district and any kind of private schools, pursuant to an IEP right now, it's a little bit murky as to who's going to be on the hook for what. At this point right now, kind of in practice, what it seems to be is that the private schools are the ones that are that are also providing remote learning if a student is placed on an IEP at a data district placement, and that we are still awaiting guidance from the state. And I thought that was forthcoming, relatively forthcoming, that's going to be spelled out further. I think that parents rightfully and school districts and the private schools are all kind of asking the same questions. I think that right now it's unclear as to who's obligated to provide what.
I know districts are getting in touch with out-of-district schools. I've seen a couple of emails going around in the last few days to check in with both the out-of-district school and the family as to whether or not that out-of-district school has provided adequate technology, has provided adequate sort of services and supports. Obviously, we're 6 weeks into this. This feels a little bit late, but this is obviously an ongoing sort of developing situation for parents and the district. So we also had a couple of questions about IEP meetings.
Sorry, excuse me.
Yes.
Hi. Sorry. Hi, my name's Cindy Nielsen. I'm the Assistant Superintendent for Special Ed. How are you?
Hi.
I just wanted to follow up on the Chromebook question or the technology need for BPS right now. Please, I'll put my email address in the chat so you can please take it down. If you have a student that's a student that's at an out-of-district placement that does not have the technology, please let me know. And we will work with you. I'm sure you've all seen over the news that we've been distributing Chromebooks to students so they have technology. We are working very close with all the other districts to make sure that students have the access to what they need in order to have access to what they're providing. So please just email and let us know, and we'll take care of it. Thanks.
Thank you so much. That's really helpful. So question about IEP meetings. So in terms of the IEP meetings that are happening during this period of remote learning, if you're having an annual review, the conversation should be about what does a student need, assuming that we all return to school, and that services and supports are delivered in a school setting. That should be what goes on your IEP. There should also be a conversation about how that's going to be delivered, what that's going to look like during this period of remote education. But the sort of different or decreased remote services should not be what is written down on the IEP. Students should continue to have their stay put rights, to have continued services and supports that are sort of presupposing an in-school delivery format. There was another question about parent attendance at meetings. So parents of students who need a lot of one-to-one services and who are having difficulty attending meetings during this period of time. What I've seen many districts doing is offering parents the ability to reconvene a team when school starts back up, so not requiring parents to consent to the virtual meeting format, but understanding that that's hugely impactful for those students and parents that really do require a team meeting during this period of time. I would encourage you to work with your team chair in hopes of coming up with a time or a format that works for you, despite the childcare role that usually does not impact your ability to attend the meeting. You want to take some questions, Alicia?
Sure. So there's some questions here that are coming in about timelines, and again, timelines, especially for reevaluations and evaluations, those have been determined to kind of be deferred until it is safe to have that evaluation in person. So that's a timeline that that likely is moving at this point. There was one here about a 3-year reevaluation being extended. Again, important to document things in writing, I think, at this point. Have the communication, have the conversation with the team about these things, about the implications of what's happening. I think that teams have been very responsive to parents' inquiries, to date. If you're not getting responses, continue to follow up. I think that, doing so in writing is important to create that record if you need it down the line. But I think that a lot of these things might be able to be, hopefully agreed upon through communication with the team in terms of timelines. But in terms of IEP meetings, if that can go forward remotely and it's reasonable to do so, again, something to certainly request. Let's see what else. There's some questions here about, risking losing placement. I think, as Melanie kind of just touched on, stay put will be operative. And so kind of remote learning is not necessarily, it's not becoming kind of the new menu of services for a student or a new placement. And so changes in placement need to be agreed upon. It needs to be consented to. And so that's something that, just shouldn't change because of COVID-19 related concerns.
We've also gotten a couple of questions about IEP services being delivered as written during this period of time and whether or not the failure to do so gives rise to compensatory services claims. One example was sort of a small group reading support group. You know, I think that there are a couple of different ways to answer that question. One is that the guidance from the state says that a student has the right to FAPE during this time. So if the student does require small group reading or a certain service or accommodation to receive a FAPE, then certainly that's something that the team needs to deliver. Obviously, the student would require it to receive a FAPE or it wouldn't be in the IEP. That said, the state is also saying that students and parents and teachers all need to figure out how to do this flexibly. It would seem to me that a remote small group reading session could be arranged relatively easily via Zoom. It would be wonderful if teachers and parents could figure out a way and a time to deliver that. That said, you know, if your student is entitled to one small group reading session per week and hasn't gotten any, that does not necessarily mean that you get 6 small group reading sessions or 10 small group reading sessions, you know, 1 per week of the closure upon return to school. It really is an individualized discussion that the parent needs to have with the remaining members of the team once we're sort of back in gear with school. And that's, you know, that's with any of the services. That's with speech language, that's with OT, that's with PT, that's with any kind of counseling services. The hope is that those services are being delivered remotely or are going to be geared up to be delivered remotely. But if they're not, that doesn't necessarily mean that a student has the right to those services on the return to school.
Are there other topics that you're seeing, Melanie, that we need to address?
So a couple. So first was if the parents want to retain their child and the district doesn't want to. I think that is a question that comes up in a regular school year as well. Parents who would like to retain their child in the previous grade, and if the district wants to keep the child moving forward. And that's a conversation that has to happen on a sort of a student by student, team by team basis. I don't know that the coronavirus shutdown has changed that so much. I think the way that the DESE's guidance has really impacted the situation is they're explicitly recommending promotion. So if a family feels differently, that's a conversation to certainly have with the team. The other question that I saw was the plans of the BSEA. So for those of you who don't know, the BSEA is the Bureau of Special Education Appeals, and that is the dispute resolution body in the Commonwealth that deals with all the special education disputes. Alicia and I practice at the BSEA, and they are operating. I wouldn't say they're operating normally. They've had similar sort of technology access issues to the rest of us during this time, but the hearing officers they're accepting filings. The hearing officers are conducting virtual or telephonic motion sessions. There is the option for virtual hearing. Reese Ehrlichman is conducting remote settlement conferences. Some of the hearing officers are able to conduct remote pre-hearing conferences. So it's an evolving situation. I think the state needed to get them some updated technology. I think their stuff was pretty out of date, but they are up and running. PRS is also up and running, the Program Quality Assurance PR system. Used to be called PQA. And they are up and running as well. We actually have a blog post on our website at kcslegal.com about the current status of the dispute resolution systems. If anybody has something pending at the BSEA or wants to file something, that's a good place to go for an update. So another question was if parents have safety concerns about sending their student back to school once schools do reopen, whether they would lose a placement or whether, you know, remote learning would stop. And I don't know the answer to that question. I think that it would, you know, hopefully be a discussion between the parent and the team at that point, talking through, you know, if the child or others in the house had particular health concerns maybe that predispose them to complications should, you know, COVID-19 enter the household. You know, the student, it would be hard to imagine a situation where the student would lose a placement as a result of that, but I think it would depend on how long all of this goes on and the extent to which parents remain concerned after a period of time, whether or not the district wanted to continue to work with them on that.
We had also received a question about kind of another form of transition, moving. So moving either, you know, from Massachusetts to another state or coming into Massachusetts from another state. And so, I mean, IEPs are portable documents. So the question was geared at kind of what should parents do to prepare for that type of transition. And because IEPs are portable documents, you do want to make sure that kind of everything that everything that the student's been receiving is clearly identified in the IEP. You know, that things that the students are receiving that, you know, might not be kind of apparent from the face of the IEP that maybe should be documented in the additional information section or something along those lines, that everything is there, that there aren't kind of understandings and that, you know, the way that certain things are delivered that might not be spelled out, you know, with as much specificity as might be required to make it clear to another district. And, you know, the other thing too is that if you have concerns with the student's current programming and an IEP, you know, your IEP responses should clearly document that. And so that, you know, the new district could see, just looking at the document with you know, a comprehensive response attached, you know, appended right to that, you know, whether it's in letter form or it's right on kind of the response pages, but making sure that that is something that somebody who has no idea, who's kind of looking at a new IEP, would be able to know kind of what the programming was, the nature of its services, kind of what that student is entitled to. Because that IEP is effectively, you know, it should be implemented until the student is able to be evaluated by that new school district, and then, you know, the process starts off with the new. So making sure that because that document's portable and that you can take it with you when you go, that it says everything that, you know, that it's an accurate reflection of what the programming and services are.
Thank you. I just want to jump in there because a message we put there is that if you have a question, you also want to say it verbally. And if you raise your hand under the chat, then we will unmute your specific microphone just so that you can ask your question live too, because they're doing a great job keeping up with the questions, but as we're winding down, and I want to be mindful that it is about to be 8:30, but those, if you want to stay on, finish asking and answering questions, that's completely fine. Just be mindful of the time and try to make your question general and concise. Thank you.
So just a couple other questions that came in that I want to tick through quickly. Somebody said their student is getting 1 hour per week of classroom of learning. The advisory says that students should be engaged for about half of the regular school day. So 3 hours per day is what districts are supposed to be shooting for. So I would say 1 hour per week is something you want to talk to your team about. Also a question about compiling a best practices sort of document about remote learning. I think that's a great idea. Jeff Riley, who's the commissioner who put out the guidance for remote learning that's linked at the end of our presentation, there's some pretty good stuff in there as well that can kind of start your discussion if that's something that you would be pulling together. Also questions about kids who are having trouble engaging in the online learning, concern about how that's going to impact them, versus kids who are doing great with this model of online learning and how can we build on that. I think everybody's learning new things about all of these kids, about their response to online learning. I think for some kids, this is basically the worst thing that's ever happened to them. And for other kids, this is terrific. And I think that we can take these lessons both as parents and as advocates for special education students more generally forward, to make sure that if we've learned something new about a student during this period of time, we expand that into the hopefully normal period of schooling that comes after all of this. If somebody does well with remote instruction, then let's see if we can incorporate some remote learning into their plan going forward, versus somebody who's really having a hard time with the remote instruction right now. I think a lot of kids are having a really hard time, and I think that it's going to be a bit of a default position to assume that this was hard for a lot of students and a lot of families, if not most students and most families. And so, particularly for a 6-year-old, I think that, impacting somebody going forward, it's, the teachers know that this is hard, right? Teachers know, and principals and special education administrators understand that this is really hard for kids and it's really hard for families. And once your student is back in school, they will assess that student, they will meet that student where he or she is, and they'll move forward from there.
Okay, I'm gonna start unmuting people that have questions. First, Michael, you're unmuted, go ahead.
Hi, I'm not Michael, I'm his wife, Christina. So I have a question. You mentioned earlier, there are a lot of questions about essential employees. My husband and I both are. He works for the city, essentially doing all the COVID response for the Public Health Commission, and I'm a physician assistant. We have opted not to send our kids to the emergency childcare at this time because our youngest, who's in special ed at the Henderson, is medically complex, and we don't want to have her be at risk. In the future, it may be something we have to do. But you mentioned earlier, what are our responses during the summer if extended school year is remote? We kind of double our efforts. But if our children are not under our care on a day-to-day basis, is this something that the emergency childcare centers are responsible for? And how do they go about that when they have other kids who are not special ed?
That's a good question. There's nothing that I've seen that puts FAPE requirements onto these emergency childcare centers. My understanding is that it's more of custodial care, sort of babysitting, as opposed to school. None of this is ideal at all, but I haven't seen anything saying that there is sort of the responsibility for implementing IEPs or anything with these emergency childcare centers.
Okay, and is there a time frame in which we'll find out whether or not, I know we're all kind of assuming that summer camps and extended school year in person are going to be canceled. When will we find out? So we can plan for childcare, et cetera.
Yeah, we don't have any better information on that than you do, unfortunately.
Okay, and should we, one more follow-up. So my daughter gets now 30 minutes of speech, PT, and OT twice a week when she's in school. We just met with our team today, and we're going to start with once a week. Shouldn't we be getting equal to what we're getting in person, if not more, during this time? And how do we go about that?
I've not heard of anybody who's getting more than they would usually be entitled to on their IEP. I know that there was a licensing issue with speech language pathologists for a little while. Okay. I believe that's been fixed. And in terms of, the provision of services, the DESE guidance says that services will look different and may not be delivered at the same sort of frequency or intensity, but that it's sort of a conversation for parents to have with their team. And in terms of the advocacy effort, anybody who is trying to get a team to provide more services or get particular services provided, that the district is not necessarily offering during this remote period of time. You know, the guidance there about how FAPE is, you know, continues to be a right for students during this period of time, and how we need to be focusing on skills that will prepare kids for the next grade, I think would be really good touch points to mention.
Okay, the next person, Digital Dinosaur, I think that's Linda.
Yes, it is. The quick question is this. When your son's internship is abruptly shut down, the question is, what happens to completing it when it comes to, as they say, the certificate of completion, when the internship is not finished and the so-called on-the-job skills that were supposed to be completed are not done, and what's going to happen with that?
So I think with that, I mean, again, I think that, you know, kind of coming back to this kind of compensatory ed type of situation, you know, compensatory services can be, you know, can be rendered after completion. And so I don't know if this is a situation in which, you know, your son is not going to be able to get a certificate of completion because the internship is not completed. Is that kind of the nature of your question? Or when is he going to be able to kind of make up those hours that he's missing that are critical to his education?
Well, if we return in the fall, he's also aging in October, so
you can continue to get those services on a compensatory basis even after he ages out.
Okay.
So the idea would be that you would make a compensatory services claim or discuss it with your team, given that he's aging out but still has missed these critical hours of services, and hope that the team agrees to continue providing those services or that internship opportunity essentially on a compensatory basis after he turns 22.
All right, thank you.
You're welcome.
The next person is Gina. You're muted, go ahead.
Yeah, thank you. And that's great with that pronunciation. It is a Gina. So it's kind of, I don't know, they say complicated. So we've been at Taylor Elementary. My son is in the 3rd grade. We've been there for 2 years. This is the 2nd year. So he was there, we started in the 2nd grade, and this is his 2nd year in the 3rd grade. And because of various transitions in the school with IEP coordinators, and I think there are a few other things, we have been working off of basically almost a 2-year-old IEP. Many other things have kind of transpired in my son's needs, like, for example, needing more concentrated time for reading, as per example. But those needs aren't getting met because we're still working off of an old IEP. In all the complication, if you will, I have been trying to get him out of that school for one of the reasons of just those transitions, and we've kind of just fallen through the cracks. But because we're working off of this old IEP, we are just seemingly helplessly stuck there. And I just really kind of don't know where to go from here. We just had an IEP meeting last week, so yay for that, the first one. And so I'm sending back the IEP with revisions, but it's like, oh, he doesn't get those services via the current IEP that he has, but it's an old IEP. So I'm just gonna stop talking because like I say, I just really don't know where to go from here. And I'm hoping someone could.
Hi again. Hi, Gina. Hi, Gina. My name's Cindy Nielsen. I'm the Assistant Superintendent for Special Education. I'm going to put, I do have access to the chat that's in the Can you see the chat?
Yes.
Okay, I'm gonna put my email in there. If you could just email me your information. You'll also probably hear back from Jennifer Sweeney that can help you out specifically with what's been happening. Okay?
Awesome. All right. Thank you.
And another thing to know just in general is that a district cannot provide services that you've not consented to. So often we see parents reject the entire IEP if they feel like certain services or certain goals are not adequate. But that means that none of the IEP can be implemented. So it's important to do a partial acceptance if there are certain things that you do agree with and you do want implemented, so that you can at least make some incremental progress towards having a fully accepted IEP, even if the whole document is not to your liking. I did have one question about remote learning plans. Somebody chatted it to me privately. The district should be developing remote learning plans for each student, which is essentially a document sort of communicating with families about how their IEP services will be delivered remotely. So that's something that you should start to see.
I'm going to unmute you, Molly. Go ahead and ask your question.
Okay, can you guys hear me?
Yep.
Okay, so my son, he's a K1 student, and so he has an IEP for speech only, and he was receiving that once a week for 30 minutes. So when all of this happened mid-March, I was told that he couldn't receive them anymore because the speech pathologists, they weren't allowed to do anything virtually because they will lose their licenses. So my son has not been receiving any services since the school's been closed. So now that there's been new guidances by the Justin, like, that's gonna go forward as of May 4th. Is that changing across the board, or should I be reaching out to my son's, coordinator to find out whether or not he's receiving that, and are they supposed to be given those services through Zoom or FaceTime or however?
Sorry, this is Cindy. Hi, Molly. If you could, my email address is again in the chat. If you want to email me your specific information, as was already explained and you are also expressed, there was some challenges around the teletherapy requirements that were occurring with speech and language. I just talked to them on Monday, all of the speech and language pathologists across the system, so all 150 of them, about what needs to be done to move towards the services being provided online through a Zoom or Google Hangout. So if you want to just email me your specific information, I can make sure that obviously all speech and language should be reaching out to everyone, but we can also follow up specifically, okay?
Yeah, the thing with my school is that I feel like I'm always chasing them. So now with this, with the COVID issue, I think that it's more difficult. So I usually don't go into the meetings. So I'm glad that you guys created this Zoom meeting so that I can participate. And so maybe you can help push that, because I feel like I'm always chasing my coordinator, my special coordinator for my son's school. So I'll appreciate your assistance with this. So thank you.
Great, thank you.
Okay, next question is from Fabian.
Yes, hi. My question, I think, is probably, my daughter is receiving her services, but the thing is, like, in her IEP, she used to have 5 days a week. Now she's getting it twice a week in a small group, but not the same amount of time. So I feel like, she's not getting what she's supposed to get. Is that something that has to be working with the team to ask for compensatory, or how do we move from there? And also the other things, like, I know that they studying on the 4th, they're supposed to have, half of the day they have to meet, but it seems like, it's getting shorter. It's not, like, for instance, if they go to school for like 6 hours, they should be learning for 3 hours. If they're not getting it for 3 hours, what is the essential of make sure that, they are getting the right services that they need to?
So in terms of the services, it's the guidance has been that yes, students are entitled to a free appropriate public education. So theoretically, those services should continue, but they're going to look different. And so in terms of the frequency, I think that that's something, or whether it's now delivered in a small group when it wasn't before, if the nature of it has changed somewhat, that's provided for, because, we're not operating right now in ideal circumstances, unfortunately, but it's something that you should certainly continue to track. And then it would be, as you mentioned, kind of a discussion about compensatory ed, in the future. So definitely making sure that you're taking note of exactly, to the extent that you can, kind of what's being delivered, and what essentially would be owed, and what your student is missing out on at this time. So that it's not going, the IEP isn't right now going to be implemented the exact same way as it would be if schools were operating normally.
Yeah, I totally understand that, and I do appreciate, like, they doing the best they can, and I'm working with her on that. But I feel that she's not ready to move to I don't think she'll be ready to move to the next class, or to the next class that she needs to be in September. I know that they're gonna do evaluation, so I feel like she's, instead of moving forward or getting where she needs to be, it's like she's moving backward. So I feel like I'm doing my part too, and working with her, and then working with the teacher where I have to do different things and tutoring and stuff like that. But I'm just understanding, like, other kids, the same thing, like in the group where it's 30 minutes, you have 4 kids, it's only like they're getting 10 minutes, and that, 3 kids, you have 10 minutes only of the services, which is like 20 minutes per week when you used to have 5 hours a week. So that's a huge difference.
Mm-hmm. I think a couple of things, that the live instruction is not supposed to be 3 hours per day. I know that's not what you were just saying, but I just wanted to clarify that that Boston's not sort of suggested or required to provide live instruction for 3 hours per day. It's more that students should be engaged in schoolwork of some kind for about half of the typical school day. And then in terms of the services not being provided on schedule, I think this is another moment where you make sure that you put this in writing to your team, and they'll either respond favorably, or you can continue sort of tracking maybe the difficulties that your daughter may be having, to really inform a discussion about compensatory services later on.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome.
So I just want to say that it's 8:47, so we're going to start to wrap up. And some of our BPS people also do have to sign off. Thank you so much. This has been really great and helpful, having all these different questions, and for all of you coming and calling in today. At one point, we had like 97 people on the call, which is fantastic, and we still have 60 on it. So it's been really great. It shows that people have questions that need answering. I don't know if, Alicia, Melanie, we didn't talk about this, but if people didn't get their question answered, or they just want to touch base, would it be feasible for them to reach out or send us questions we can send to you? Would that be okay?
Absolutely.
Great, thank you so much. Thank you to all of our presenters, Melanie, Alicia, Marcia. Thank you, Cindy, for jumping in there with those answers specific to BPS also. We really appreciate everyone coming out. Thank you.